Hello and welcome to thebusiness.com. My guest today is someone who was born and brought up in, well, the South Riding of Yorkshire, if you like, now all part of East Yorkshire on the periphery of the city of Hull. But someone who has been very much part of the life of Kingston upon Hull for most of her career. Kath Lavery, a former Labour councillor, and many, many other things as well that you still do. You're not all a former, obviously, but you were, I mean, you're a South Riding girl, aren't you?
I was born and raised in Burton Pidsey in the wilds of rural Holderness, yes.
So what has kept, we're jumping forward a little bit, but why stay in this area? Has there been something that has kept you here? Is it the area, is it the people, is it the city, what is it?
I suppose if I'm being completely brutal, it was work, of course, but I did my degree in Leeds and I did a degree in information science, which is that technical end of librarianship, pure sciences, and the sort of librarianship of that. And I was under contract to Hull City Libraries to come back, so came back from uni, moved into Hull, fell in love with the place, and the rest is history.
So it was always your intention to stick around?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. My family are here, and whilst Burton Pidsey is that little bit further out, and it was a very different upbringing being in that very tiny rural village to being brought up in Hull. It's all this end of the world, and this is where my family has been for generation upon generation. So no, I belong here.
What was childhood like for you?
As a small child, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I mean, being brought up, my dad was a farm worker and a gamekeeper, so we ate what he grew and what he shot, and we lived in a 17th, 18th century cottage, and my sister and brother and I, I'm the eldest, and I went to this tiny village primary school 2 minutes away from home, and it was glorious. Freedom of the village, you know. I mean, it was that sort of film effect thing where little children ran around looking brown and had lots of fresh food and ran around in fields. You know, it was that sort of upbringing. But of course, you grow into a teenager. You're bused to Withensea to school, which was a very different experience. And as a young adolescent and then as a teenager, it was lonely and difficult to find friends that you really connected with, and to have any sort of social life, of course. So if it weren't for the young farmers movement, I may have completely gone under. But yes, it was great as a small child and difficult as a teenager.
A complete contrast then when you left there to go to Leeds to go to university.
Oh, I was a terrifically country hick person with a very weird accent. Yes, it was unbelievable.
It was bright lights, big city almost, wasn't it?
Oh, yes, and I got lost all the time. Buses going in the wrong direction and all. Yeah, it was, but I fell in love with cities in Leeds. Absolutely fell in love with cities, with urban landscape and the culture and the shops and the theatres and people, and not having to go 15 miles to the nearest fish and chip shop. You know, I mean, that sort of thing was just wonderful. So never wanted to go back.
What did you study at university?
Information science.
With what intention?
With the intention of being a specialist librarian and cataloguer. I can classify chemical literature by the number of free carbon atoms. You know, I was a science student. I have a BSc, so I did pure sciences and the storage, retrieval, dissemination of scientific and technical information.
You've lost me already.
I was a complete and utter science nerd.
Did that continue after university?
Yeah.
What did you do?
Well, I ended up as an information scientist in the NHS. Obviously, that was I sort of had a hint of where I was going, but so I ended up dealing with medical information and data and working with doctors and in medical libraries and things like that. But I still read New Sciences for fun. You know, I've still got that science background.
You will come on to your the PCT connection that you have in a moment or two, and I don't want to infer that it was years ago that you were doing your science bit within the NHS. But what was the NHS like when you started in it?
It was doing what it's doing now. It was reorganising. The NHS is always reorganising, and nobody ever comes to a conclusion that it's right. It was a lot more public sector than it is now. You know, the NHS has moved to a much stronger business model for obvious reasons. You know, funding the NHS is always an issue, and as drugs get more expensive and the population ages, that is more of a pressure now than it was in the late 1970s when I was there. So it was much, much more based in a public sector model than in the traditional public sector model than what you see now.
Is it better now as more of a business model?
Yes, much more efficient.
More efficient?
Now, yes. Oh, absolutely. And with people in it who can balance that business ethic with the public sector ethic, you know, so that there are people who really understand that there's nothing wrong with being in a surplus, because if you're not in a surplus, you can't do the wonderful things that you want to do for patients. If all you do at a board meeting is fight deficit, then you can't do the great things for patients you want to do. Whereas in the late 70s, deficits were just there and huge and part and parcel of everyday life.
And we had to live with them.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
You went on to become chairman of the Primary Care Trust, the local
Eventually,
Primary Care
yes.
Trust. Eventually, we'll
Yes.
move on to that. What made you want to take up that role?
I lost a seat in a
Right.
local election.
Yeah.
I mean, I ended up, of course, becoming a shop steward in my early days, and when NALGO was the union that represented the public sector, and I became a shop steward and then a full-time officer for NALGO, and then of course Unison as it became so. And I was absolutely embedded in the trade union and labour movement, and I spent 30 years in it, as you know, and ended up being a councillor and a full-time officer for my union. And
Was it that passion that drove you into politics in the first place?
oh yes, yeah. I mean, I'm the classic Labour route. I was a trade unionist who became a Labour Party member and a politician. I mean, absolutely classic building block in the trade union movement. And it's that I'd always had that thing about fairness, even as a small child. And the trade union movement picked that up and ran with it. I wasn't a student activist, never was active at university, but and that grew. But come 1998, at a very important part of my political career, at least I thought it was, I was defeated in a local election. And a guy called Ray Gray, who some people will know as still a Unison officer, said there's these new things coming out in the NHS and I've suggested you go on one. So when he stood on the picket line, when I externalised CHCP last year and I had to cross his picket line, we looked at each other a bit because of course it was him that put me in the NHS in the first place. But
His fault.
yeah, so I stood for that because I'd lost this seat, and whilst I was still working for Unison, I was off the council.
How did you? I mean, the obvious answer would be devastated. Of course it would. But how did you feel when you were defeated, when you did lose that seat?
It is the most shockingly awful moment. And however much you dislike a politician or you're in the different party or whatever, once it's happened to you, you can always empathise. I watched Carl Minns on election night on the telly.
Well, he lost there as leader of Hull City Council. He lost that, and he lost his seat, and his party lost virtually everything as well.
Yeah.
You couldn't have done much more to not you personally, but it couldn't have happened. No more could have happened to an individual or a party than did on that night.
Absolutely, and you only had to look at his face, and I recognise that face. Because you work yourself to death, whoever you are, whichever party you're in, you do that. And you go into an election, and Carl didn't expect to lose in the way he lost. I mean, I think he knew it was going to be very close. I'd spoken to him a couple of days before. And I certainly didn't expect to lose. And all you can see are these votes being counted, and the piles growing in the wrong pile, and there's nothing you can do. And you walk in as councillor or MP or whatever, and you walk out as Mr. or Mrs. You're out of office on the weekend. You
It's
clear
as
your
quick
desk
as
the
that.
following day. There are no packages. There's no redundancy package. There's
So,
nothing like that.
so when you lost your seat, did you then say, right, that's it, I'm done with this
No,
now?
no. The full intention was that I would go back in a year's time. It actually took me 4 years because I got this job in the NHS in the early days of the PCTs. In fact, wasn't going back until the Labour Party were sort of short of candidates in 2002, persuaded me to stand again. And I did, and of course that was the year that I won again. I beat the guy that had beaten me in '98, and everybody else lost. So it was the year that Simone Butterworth took over as
That's right.
with the first year of the Liberal Democrats.
Yeah. What about the PCT? Because we're seeing the demise of the PCT now, aren't we? How do you feel about that? It's something that you were there from at the beginning, something that you've built up, something that your team has built up. Now it's going. How does that make you feel?
Very sad, actually. I mean, you can't put it any other way. I think we did a tremendous job, and we're continuing to do one, actually, because we've got 2 years to go yet. But we are the country's, or at least England's, best PCT. You know that we came top of the hierarchy, and we did it with a huge spring in our step, with a massive amount of enthusiasm and energy and commitment and fun, and it was a great team, and it showed in what we did. And being part of something like that is the best way to spend your life. And we've lost 70 people already, of course.
Mm.
You know, so
the government have said that clearly the PCTs are going because the government don't see the necessity for them anymore. Do you think there is a necessity, hand on heart, trying to be as objective as possible? Is there still? Because we talked earlier about the business model of the NHS.
I think the answer to that is yes, if you do it like we did it. If I'm being honest, particularly down south, and this government represents southern constituencies, if I were them looking at the southern PCTs, I would come to the same conclusion. I only wish that they'd taken the time to get on a train and look at what, particularly the Yorkshire PCT, because I'm not just talking about mine, because if you look at the list of the best PCTs in the country, the top quartile is dominated by Yorkshire. So to look at how we've done it and what we did and why we're successful. And it was about that commitment to a business model, to a commissioning framework, to commissioning from the best and performance managing those contracts in a business way and delivering for patients through that model. And so if they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater, in my opinion. I'm not denying that there has been some real weaknesses, particularly in London and in the southern counties, but they could have looked at what we were doing first.
You've taken risks.
Just a few.
You are a risk taker, and I suppose I would be remiss if I didn't mention
the boat.
Yes. The boat. And if you're not from the Hull or East Yorkshire area, you won't have a clue what we're talking about. But this is a 68-foot clipper yacht.
It is.
Called Cat Zero.
No, it's called One Hull.
Oh, it's called One Hull, I beg your pardon, yes.
Charity's called Cat Zero.
That's right. That you bought, that the PCT bought.
£400,000.
£400,000, and it got you in so much hot water.
It got us on News at 10.
It did.
It got me phone calls from people I knew in lots and lots of different parts of the country saying, this isn't you, is it?
You're playing with £400,000 worth of public funds.
Yes.
That you must have known when you started thinking about this is going to get an awful lot of controversy.
It wasn't what was at the forefront of our minds when we made the decision to do it. I have to say that the guy that put his hand up was my chief executive, and then turned to me and said, "That's all right, isn't it, Chairman?" And I went, "Yeah, okay." We were in a presentation about what this programme could do for the young people of Hull, and I was sat next to Chris in a One Hull meeting, and the video on of high seas and young people on clippers, and I saw his face go, because if anybody knows Chris Long, of course, he had an army background and is very keen on physical pursuit. And they said, it's just a pity we've not got the money to buy the boat. And his hand went up and he went, "We'll do that." And then turned to me and said, "Is that all right?"
Yeah.
Yes, it is. There is a really serious intent to it. We were sitting on a massive amount of what's called non-recurrent money at the time. Millions and millions and millions of it, which we had in the past lent to other NHS organisations, which had been paid back all at once. And I'm talking above 60 million. It was big amounts of money. Mm. And it was non-recurrent, so we had to spend it in 2 years. We took on a lot of people who on 2-year salaries. We bought the old Nuffield Hospital at Castle Hill, did it up and gave it to the acute trust. We've spent a lot of money on doing up mental health in estate. But we couldn't employ people for a long time in it because it was 2-year long. It was one-off money. So we spent £400,000 of it to support Cat Zero. Cat Zero is a 3-month programme of work with young people who are NEETs, not in employment, education or training. It's not a boat trip for bad kids who've got into trouble. It's not a fortnight in the Med for a kid who's been robbing people's houses. It's a 3-month programme of training which includes a lot of health stuff. We don't allow them on if they smoke, for instance, so we stop them smoking. We do food and sexual health advice and drug advice and smoking and exercise and all this sort of stuff. And we get them ready for work. And in the middle of all that is a fortnight at sea, in some horrible rough seas in the North Sea, cooped up on this 68-foot clipper with Danny Watson, who of course was the round-the-world clipper skipper. Mm-hmm. And they work 4 hours on, 4 hours off. They can't get off unless we helicopter them off. they've got to work together as a team. They've got to understand what it means to play your part in a team, because if you don't, the boat don't work, and others are doing your job for you. And it is life-changing. And we've had about 270 kids through it. 180, 190 of them are now in employment or training. The real difference, of course, is that this group of youngsters costs the public sector huge amounts of money. 1 in 7 of them will die within 10 years. And they get pregnant young, they smoke and drink, they live chaotic lifestyles if you don't get them early. And that, we think, they will cost the public sector at least £100,000 a piece. We've got nearly 200 of them through. That's a big saving already. But you can count the money, but it's the life, isn't it? There's somebody's brothers, sisters, children.
So you have no regrets about signing that cheque?
No. We'll do it again tomorrow, because it's been hugely successful. It is changing lives. And if the NHS... Somebody said to me on the weekend, well, of course, the problem with the NHS, it's going to become unaffordable because of all these, and I'll use the word immigrants, who are using the NHS and not paying for it. If the NHS wasn't treating people who are ill through their own hand, in that their lifestyle choices have given them the condition that we're treating, you wouldn't have a problem in funding your NHS. So we've got to get upstream and stop people living the lifestyles that cause the cancer, stroke, heart disease, lung diseases, these sort of COPD diseases, diabetes, that is caused by those lifestyles, that actually that is the real driver behind a very expensive NHS. And we'll always treat people that have cancer, of course we will, but we'd rather didn't get it in the first place.
What drives you?
Changing the world. Isn't that just a
Well,
classic?
it sounds like it though, doesn't it? I mean, you've always been involved in the public sector.
Yes, and increasingly, of course, the business community now.
Yeah.
But you get that I've got to make a difference thing, and I've had it all my life. I think that you come into two different sorts of people, don't you? The people who look out there and say there's lots of things wrong and turn around and go back and sit and watch Coronation Street. And then there's people like me who look out there and think something's wrong and sort of have to go and do something about it. Whether you succeed or not is another matter, but you have to go and do something about it. It is the best way to spend your life. It's a great way to spend your life.
You say you're becoming increasingly involved with the business community now.
Yes.
And I know now that you're chair of CSR, Corporate Social Responsibility.
Yeah.
And you've taken that on. And tell me about the other ways that you are driving things forward.
Well, obviously I am the chair of Hull and East Yorkshire Community Foundation, HEYCF, which, albeit a big charity, deals with business and CSR and has to run us at a surplus. Obviously, we can't just sit on a deficit. I'm the chair. I'm a non-exec director of a private sector company of MWS, with Melvin Sadowski, MWS, and I chair a housing association, which again has to be in surplus. We run as a business, and the Humber Sports Partnership, which is the Sport England sort of quango, I suppose, and some charities like the Warren that I'm the chair of. But you bring the same principles to all of it. If you're in deficit with any of it, whether it's the PCT or a housing association, then all your board does is deal with that. If you want your board to be doing exciting things, you've got to be in surplus. So you've got to have that business head. And that doesn't mean that your ethics and principles go out the window. Of course it doesn't. You can do something with those principles if you've got some money to do it with. If you're just sitting around saying, oh my goodness, how are we going to get out of all this big deficit? You can't do what you want to do. And I was a trade unionist. You can't treat your staff properly if you're in deficit either.
Is there anything that you still want to do?
Oh, heck yeah. My job at the foundation, the community foundation, is to grow the business. I mean, they wanted a chairman who was going to help do that. That's a big challenge still before us and one I'm looking forward to. I want to play a bigger role in MWS. I want to make my presence there worthwhile, I suppose.
Yeah.
I love being involved in sport. I've got Solutions Through Sport coming out the ground, which is the big partnership between the city's professional sports clubs, which the Community Foundation is involved with, and the sports partnerships involved with. And we hope to do something wonderful with that. And I want to stay in the NHS post PCT, and there are some interesting things possible there. So, yeah, I mean, there's lots and lots of things
There's
to
no
do
stopping
yet.
you?
No, not yet. No.
Absolutely.
No, not yet.
Continued success to you, Kath.
Thank you.
Thank you for talking to me.
You're welcome.
Kath Lavery.
Thank you.